The smell of fresh paint and new hardwood floors hit me the moment I wheeled through the front door of my son's house. Ashley had outdone herself with the decorations for their housewarming party. String lights draped elegantly across the living room ceiling, and expensive-looking appetizers arranged on marble countertops that definitely weren't there the last time I visited. Everything looked magazine perfect, which should have made me proud. Instead, something cold settled in my stomach as I noticed how Ashley's smile faltered the second she saw my wheelchair navigating through her pristine entryway. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Martinez, and 3 years ago, my world shifted in ways I never could have imagined. I used to be the woman who could lift 50-pound bags of concrete mix without breaking a sweat, who could balance on scaffolding 30 feet in the air while directing a crew of tough construction workers who respected me not because I was their boss's wife, but because I earned my place in that male-dominated world through pure grit and competence. I was Elena Martinez, construction foreman, the woman who built half the commercial buildings in Riverside, Texas, with my own calloused hands. Then came that rainy Tuesday morning in October when everything changed forever. I remember the way the steel beam caught the weak sunlight as it swung loose from the crane. Remember shouting a warning to my crew. Remember diving to push young Tommy Chen out of the way. What I don't remember is the impact, the sound my spine made when 2 tons of steel pinned me against the concrete foundation we'd poured just days before. I woke up in Memorial Hospital 6 days later to a world that had fundamentally altered while I was unconscious. The doctors used words like compression fractures and spinal cord damage, permanent mobility impairment, and adaptive equipment. My brain couldn't process what they were telling me at first. Me, Elena Martinez, who had never needed help from anyone, who had worked construction sites since I was 19 years old, who had raised my son Jim practically single-handedly after his father died when Jim was 12. The idea that I would need to relearn everything, from how to shower to how to reach items on grocery store shelves, felt like they were describing someone else's life. The workers' compensation settlement came through 8 months later. $237,000, they said. As if any amount of money could give me back the ability to walk upstairs to tuck my grandson into bed or stand at my kitchen counter to make the Sunday morning pancakes that had been our family tradition for 20 years. But I took the money because I had to be practical, because I needed to retrofit my little ranch house on Maple Street with ramps and grab bars and a roll-in shower, because someone had to pay for the physical therapy and the wheelchair and all the other adjustments that came with my new reality. What the insurance company and the lawyers didn't know was that I kept most of that money untouched. I learned to live on my disability payments and the small pension from the construction company, learned to budget and clip coupons and shop the clearance racks at the grocery store. Old habits from raising Jim on a single income die hard, and I found that I didn't need much to be comfortable in my modified little house. The settlement money sat in a savings account, earning modest interest, while I figured out what this next chapter of my life was supposed to look like. Jim visited me every week after the accident, bringing his wife Ashley and their 8-year-old son Marcus. Those visits were the highlight of my weeks, watching Marcus grow taller and seeing Jim settle into his role as a father and husband. Jim worked as a marketing coordinator for a local real estate firm, steady work, but not the kind that would make anyone rich. Ashley had stayed home with Marcus since he was born, which I respected, even though money was often tight for them. They rented a small 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town, and I knew Jim worried about providing the kind of life for his family that he thought they deserved. It was during one of those weekly visits that Jim mentioned their dream of buying a house. Ashley sat on my couch flipping through real estate magazines while Marcus played with his toy trucks on the floor, and I could see the longing in her eyes as she showed me pictures of houses with backyards and 2-car garages, and all the space they'd never had in their cramped apartment. Jim talked about saving for a down payment, about how they'd been looking at modest starter homes on the outskirts of Riverside where they could afford the mortgage payments. but even those seemed just out of reach. "Mom, we found this house on Oak Ridge Drive," Jim told me one afternoon, his voice carrying that careful hopefulness of someone trying not to want something too badly. "It's a foreclosure, needs some work, but the bones are good. Ashley loves it because it has this big kitchen where she could actually cook real meals instead of heating everything up in our tiny apartment kitchen." I asked him to show me pictures on his phone, and as I scrolled through the images of a 2-story house with good structure but outdated everything, I could see why they'd fallen in love with it. The house had character, the kind of solid construction I recognized from my years in the business, but it clearly needed significant updates to be move-in ready. The kitchen still had harvest gold appliances from the 1980s, and the bathrooms looked like they hadn't been touched since the house was built. "What's the asking price?" I asked, though I already suspected from Jim's hesitant tone that it was more than they could manage. "$165, Jim said, then quickly added, "But we could make an offer for less since it needs so much work. The thing is, even if we got it for $150, we'd need at least another $30,000 or $40,000 to make it livable. New kitchen, updated bathrooms, maybe some flooring." Ashley's been researching contractors and getting estimates. I watched Ashley's face as Jim talked, saw how she tried to hide her disappointment behind a supportive smile. This was clearly the house she'd imagined raising Marcus in, the place where she'd pictured family dinners and birthday parties and all the milestones that make up a childhood. But wanting something and being able to afford it are two entirely different things, and I could see the resignation settling in around the edges of her enthusiasm. That night, after they'd gone home, I sat in my living room thinking about that house and about the money sitting in my savings account, earning its modest interest while my son's family squeezed into an apartment that Marcus was rapidly outgrowing. I thought about all the houses I'd helped build over the years, all the families I'd watched move into homes that my crew and I had constructed with care and pride. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The truth underneath all her careful words and forced smiles. In Ashley's mind, my disability made me less than, made me something to be managed and hidden rather than celebrated as part of the family. The woman I'd thought I'd grown close to, the woman whose dreams I'd made possible with my own money, saw me as an obstacle to her perfect party rather than the reason the party was possible at all. I sat in my wheelchair in the middle of the beautiful living room that my settlement money had created, looking at my daughter-in-law who was asking me to hide myself away so she could properly show off what I had given her, and felt something. Fundamental shift in my understanding of my place in this family I'd tried so hard to support. I decided to stay for the party. Not because Ashley's request made sense, not because I wanted to make things easier for her, but because I needed to see what would happen next. I needed to understand who my daughter-in-law really was when she thought she held all the cards. So I wheeled myself to the kitchen as requested, positioning myself near the new granite breakfast bar, where I could observe the festivities while remaining in my assigned exile. The guests began arriving precisely at 2 o'clock, and I listened to Ashley's bright, performative voice greeting each person at the front door. She'd practiced her hostess routine until it was flawless, and I could hear her launching into enthusiastic descriptions of their renovation journey before people had even handed over their coats. What struck me most was how she told the story of their home transformation, as if it had been entirely their own accomplishment, as if Jim's marketing salary and her non-existent income had somehow made possible the $85,000 in improvements that surrounded us. From my kitchen vantage point, I watched Ashley lead the first group of guests through what she called the grand tour. She gestured proudly toward the open-concept living area, explaining how they'd removed walls to create better flow, how they'd selected each piece of furniture to complement the new hardwood floors, how they'd chosen the paint colors to create the perfect ambiance for entertaining. She spoke with the authority of someone who'd made every decision, invested every dollar, and supervised every detail of the renovation process. We really wanted to create a space that reflected our family's values, Ashley told Jim's colleague. From the real estate office, her voice carrying perfectly into the kitchen where I sat listening. Quality craftsmanship, attention to detail, and a warm environment where Marcus can grow up surrounded by beauty. It took us months of planning and saving, but we finally made our dream home a reality. I gripped the armrests of my wheelchair and forced myself to remain silent. The lies came so easily to her, delivered with such conviction that I almost wondered if she'd convinced herself they were true. In Ashley's version of events, she and Jim were the successful young couple who'd transformed this house through their own hard work and financial sacrifice. There was no mention of settlement money, no acknowledgement of the woman sitting 20 feet away who'd made their dream possible. Jim appeared in the kitchen doorway during a lull between tour groups, his face flushed with excitement, and what I recognized as relief. He'd been worried about this party for weeks, anxious about impressing his coworkers and Ashley's friends, concerned about whether people would be genuinely happy for their success or secretly resentful of their beautiful new home. Seeing the positive reactions to their renovation had clearly lifted a weight from his shoulders. "Mom, are you doing okay back here?" he asked, leaning against the counter where I'd positioned myself. "I know Ashley thought it would be quieter for you in the kitchen, but if you want to join the main party, I can help clear a path through the crowd." The innocence in his voice broke my heart. Jim genuinely believed his wife had been thinking of my comfort when she'd asked me to stay hidden away. He had no idea that Ashley saw my wheelchair as an embarrassment to be managed rather than simply another piece of family logistics to accommodate. In his mind, the woman he'd married was being considerate of his disabled mother's needs, not protecting her perfect party from the visual reminder of my limitations. "I'm comfortable here," I told him, which was true in the physical sense, if not the emotional one. The kitchen was beautiful, with its white cabinets and quartz countertops and professional-grade appliances, all paid for with money that had come to me because my spine had been crushed by falling steel. "You go enjoy your guests. This is your day to celebrate." Jim squeezed my shoulder affectionately before returning to the party, and I watched him rejoin Ashley's tour group just as she was explaining the kitchen renovation to a cluster of neighbors from their old apartment complex. She guided them through the space like a museum docent, pointing out the subway tile backsplash and the farmhouse sink and the custom cabinet hardware they'd supposedly selected after months of careful research and budgeting. The kitchen was definitely our biggest splurge, Ashley said with a laugh that sounded perfectly calibrated to suggest responsible financial management rather than reckless spending. But we figured if we were going to do this renovation, we should do it right. We saved for 2 years to afford all these upgrades, and Jim even took on some freelance marketing projects to help fund the granite countertops. 2 years of saving. Freelance projects for granite countertops. The creativity of her fiction would have been impressive if it hadn't been so personally devastating. I thought about the actual timeline of their house purchase, how quickly everything had moved once I'd offered to help them, how Ashley had gone from resigned disappointment about their housing situation to confident homeowner in a matter of months. But now, listening to her rewrite history for the benefit of their guests, those months of shared excitement and collaboration seemed like something I might have imagined. The afternoon wore on, and I remained in my kitchen exile, watching group after group receive Ashley's carefully crafted tour. She'd perfected her presentation to emphasize their hard work and sacrifice, their careful planning and delayed gratification, their success in achieving the American dream through determination and smart financial choices. The narrative was so polished, so internally consistent, that I began to understand this wasn't just party conversation. This was the story Ashley had constructed about their lives, the version of reality she needed to believe in order to maintain her self-image as a deserving, successful woman. Around 4 o'clock, Linda Chen appeared in the kitchen doorway. Linda lived 2 houses down from me on Maple Street and had been my closest friend since before Jim was born. She was one of the few people who knew the truth about my settlement money and my role in funding Jim's house purchase, though I'd asked her to keep that information private. Linda was also someone who didn't tolerate nonsense from anyone, which made her presence in my kitchen both comforting and potentially explosive. "Elena, what the hell are you doing hiding back here?" Linda asked in her characteristically direct way. Her voice pitched low enough that the party guests wouldn't overhear, but loud enough to convey her irritation. "This is supposed to be a family celebration, and you're sitting in the kitchen like hired help." I glanced toward the living room where Ashley was beginning another tour, this one for Marcus's teacher and several other parents from his school. Ashley thought I'd be more comfortable back here, out of the main flow of traffic. Linda's expression darkened immediately. She'd spent 40 years as a nurse before retiring, and she had very strong opinions about how people with disabilities should be treated by their families and communities. More comfortable for who? You or her? Before I could answer, we both heard Ashley's voice rising above the general party chatter as she launched into what had clearly become her favorite part of the house tour. She was showing off the master bathroom renovation, describing the tile work and the new vanity and the rainfall showerhead they'd supposedly selected after extensive research into luxury bathroom fixtures. "We really wanted to create a spa-like experience," Ashley was saying, her voice carrying clearly into the kitchen. "Jim works so hard at his job, and I manage everything here at home, so we felt we deserved a space where we could truly relax and unwind. The renovation wasn't cheap, but we'd saved specifically for this bathroom upgrade, and we knew it would add significant value to our home." Linda's jaw tightened as she listened to Ashley's performance. "Elena, please tell me she's not taking credit for renovations that you paid for." I nodded toward the living room where Ashley was now discussing their plans for landscaping the backyard, describing the professional design consultation they were supposedly budgeting for and the outdoor kitchen they hoped to install next summer. Every word out of her mouth reinforced the fiction that she and Jim were successful homeowners who'd achieved their beautiful life through their own efforts and financial planning. "She's been telling that story all afternoon," I said quietly. According to Ashley's version of events, they saved for years to afford this renovation. Jim took on extra work to pay for the granite countertops. They carefully budgeted for every upgrade and improvement. Linda stood in my kitchen, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, watching Ashley perform for another group of impressed guests. "And where exactly do you fit into this fairy tale she's constructed?" "I don't," I admitted, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "In Ashley's story, I'm just Jim's disabled mother who needed to be kept in the kitchen so she wouldn't interfere." With the perfect party atmosphere. The tour group moved closer to the kitchen, and we could hear Ashley explaining the rationale behind their appliance choices, the research they'd done into energy efficiency ratings, the way they'd balanced luxury features with practical considerations. She spoke with the confidence of someone who'd made every decision and written every check, someone who'd earned the right to show off their beautiful home through sacrifice and hard work. Linda waited until the group had moved on before speaking, again her voice tight with controlled anger. "Elena, you can't let her get away with this. That woman is standing in a house you paid for, showing off renovations you funded, and telling everyone who'll listen about how she and Jim accomplished all this through their own efforts. It's not just dishonest, it's cruel." I knew Linda was right, but confronting Ashley in the middle of her housewarming party felt impossible. What would I say? How would I explain to a room full of guests that the successful young couple they were celebrating had actually been given their dream, home by Jim's disabled mother? How would I expose Ashley's lies without humiliating Jim, who clearly had no idea his wife was rewriting their family history for the benefit of their social circle? The party continued around us, with Ashley maintaining her role as the gracious hostess who'd created this beautiful space through her own vision and her family's financial sacrifice. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting compliments on their home improvements and sharing carefully edited anecdotes about the renovation process. Watching her perform, I began to realize that this wasn't just about hiding. my wheelchair, or managing party logistics. This was about Ashley claiming ownership of achievements that weren't hers, taking credit for generosity she hadn't shown, and erasing my contribution to her family's success. Around 5:30, as UA, the party was beginning to wind down. Frank Rodriguez arrived. Frank had been my supervisor during my final years in construction, and he was one of the few people who understood both the extent of my injuries and the size of my workers' compensation settlement. He'd visited me regularly during my recovery, helping me navigate the legal process and offering practical advice about managing my new limitations. Frank was also someone who'd never learned to filter his thoughts before speaking, which made his presence at Ashley's carefully orchestrated celebration potentially problematic. I watched Frank scan the living room, clearly looking for me among the remaining guests. When he didn't spot me immediately, he approached Jim near the front door and asked where he could find his mother. Jim pointed toward the kitchen, and I saw Frank's expression shift from confusion to concern as he realized I'd been segregated from the main party. "Elena, what are you doing back here?" Frank asked as he entered the kitchen, his weathered face creased with worry. "Jim said there was a big celebration today to show off the house renovations. Shouldn't you be out there with everyone else?" Linda stepped forward before I could answer. "Elena's been hiding in the kitchen all afternoon because Ashley didn't want her wheelchair making the guests uncomfortable during the house tours." Frank's expression went from concerned to furious in the space of a heartbeat. "She what?" I quickly gestured for both of them to keep their voices down, aware that Ashley was still giving tours to the last few groups of guests. "It's fine, Frank." Ashley worked hard to make everything perfect for today, and she was worried about the logistics of having everyone moving around comfortably. "Logistics my ass," Frank said, his voice barely contained. "Elena, do you realize what you've done for these people? Do you understand the size of the gift you gave them?" Before I could respond, we heard Ashley's voice from the living room, now addressing what sounded like the final tour group of the afternoon. Her energy hadn't flagged despite hours of entertaining, and she was delivering her renovation narrative with the same enthusiasm she'd shown to the first guests who'd arrived. "The whole process took about 4 months from start to finish," Ashley was saying, "but it was worth every day of living with construction dust and workers tramping through our space. Jim and I knew exactly what we wanted, and we weren't willing to compromise on quality just to save money. This house is going to be Marcus's childhood home, and we wanted it to be something really special." Frank listened to Ashley's speech with growing disbelief, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Elena, please tell me she's not claiming that she and Jim paid for all this work." I nodded reluctantly, and Frank's face went red with anger. "That woman is standing in a kitchen you bought, talking about renovations you funded, and taking credit for generosity she never showed. How are you sitting here listening to this?" The truth was, I didn't know how I was sitting there listening to it. Every word out of Ashley's mouth felt like another small betrayal, another erasure of my contribution to her family's happiness. But confronting her now, in front of all these guests, would create exactly the kind of scene she'd been trying to avoid when she'd asked me to stay in the kitchen. It would turn her perfect party into a family drama, and despite everything, I didn't want to do that to Jim. Linda placed her hand on my shoulder, her touch gentle despite the anger in her voice. "Elena, you've been more than patient with that woman. You've been more than generous. But there comes a point where kindness becomes enabling, and I think you passed that point about 3 hours ago." As the last tour group dispersed and the remaining guests began gathering their belongings, I could hear Ashley accepting final compliments on their beautiful home and their successful renovation. Several guests mentioned how inspiring it was to see a young family achieve their dreams through hard work and careful financial planning. One woman even asked Ashley for advice about managing a major home renovation, and I listened to my daughter-in-law dispense wisdom about contractor selection and budget management as if she'd personally overseen every aspect of the process. Jim appeared in the kitchen as the party was officially winding down, his face glowing with satisfaction and relief. The afternoon had clearly exceeded his expectations, and he seemed genuinely moved by how impressed their guests had been with their home improvements. "Mom, thank you for being so understanding about staying back here," he said, completely missing the tension radiating from Linda and Frank. I know Ashley was worried about the logistics, but everyone had such a great time, and so many people commented on how beautiful the house looks. I think we really showed people that we're doing well, that we've built something to be proud of. The innocent pride in his voice was devastating. Jim genuinely believed that he and Ashley had accomplished something remarkable, that their hard work and financial sacrifice had created the beautiful home surrounding us. He had no idea that his wife had spent the afternoon systematically erasing my contribution to their success, claiming credit for achievements that weren't hers, and generosity she'd never shown. Frank started to speak, his face still red with suppressed anger, but I caught his eye and shook my head slightly. This wasn't the moment for confrontation, not with Jim standing there glowing with pride and happiness. Whatever needed to be said to Ashley could wait until after the guests had gone home and the immediate glow of the party had faded. As the final guests departed, Ashley moved through the house, turning off lights and collecting abandoned cocktail napkins, her party smile finally beginning to fade now that the performance was over. She looked tired but satisfied, like someone who'd successfully navigated a challenging social obstacle course. When she passed through the kitchen, she gave me a brief, dismissive nod. "Thanks for being so cooperative today, Elena," she said, her tone carrying just a hint of patronizing gratitude. "I know it wasn't the most exciting afternoon for you, stuck back here, but it really helped everything run smoothly. The party was exactly what I'd hoped it would be." Linda made a small choking sound, and Frank's jaw clenched so hard I could hear his teeth grinding. But Ashley didn't seem to notice their reactions, already focused on the cleanup process and whatever post-party tasks needed her attention. After Ashley disappeared upstairs to check on Marcus, Frank turned to me with an expression of barely controlled fury. "Elena, I've been in construction for 35 years, and I've never seen anything like what just happened here. That woman spent the afternoon taking credit for work she didn't do, improvements she didn't pay for, and vision she didn't have. She erased you completely from the story of this house while sitting in a kitchen you bought with your own money." Linda nodded emphatically. "Frank's right. Ashley didn't just lie to her guests today. She created an entire alternative reality where she and Jim are successful homeowners who achieved their dreams through their own efforts. And in that reality, you don't exist except as an inconvenience to be managed and hidden away." I sat in my wheelchair in the middle of the beautiful kitchen, surrounded by the granite countertops and custom cabinets and professional appliances that my settlement money had purchased, listening to my friends express the outrage I couldn't quite access myself. Part of me wanted to feel angry, wanted to demand acknowledgement and gratitude and basic respect for what I'd done for Ashley's family. But mostly I just felt hollow, emptied out by the afternoon's revelations about who my daughter-in-law really was beneath her carefully constructed facade. The house fell quiet around us as Jim and Ashley moved through their post-party cleanup routine, and I realized that something fundamental had shifted during those few hours of exile in the kitchen. I'd entered the party believing that Ashley and I had built a relationship during the renovation process, that we'd bonded over creating something beautiful for our family. I'd thought she understood the significance of my contribution, the sacrifice I'd made to give them the home they'd dreamed of having. But listening to her perform for hours, watching her claim credit for achievements that weren't hers, understanding that she saw my disability as something to be hidden rather than simply accommodated, I realized I'd been living in my own alternative reality. The woman I'd thought I was helping, the relationship I'd thought we were building, the gratitude I'd expected to receive, none of it had been real. Ashley had accepted my money and my expertise and my involvement in creating her dream home, But she'd never accepted me as a full member of the family worth acknowledging. In her mind, I was Jim's disabled mother, someone to be managed and placated and kept out of sight when it might interfere with the image she wanted to project. The $85,000 I'd spent on their renovations hadn't bought me respect or inclusion or even basic honesty. It had simply funded Ashley's fantasy of being a successful woman who'd achieved her dreams through her own efforts. As Frank and Linda prepared to leave, both of them still radiating anger on my behalf, I realized that the real betrayal hadn't been Ashley's request that I stay in the kitchen during the party. It had been her systematic erasure of my contribution to her family's success, her transformation of my generosity into her achievement, her decision to claim ownership of a dream I'd made possible with my own sacrifice. The party was over, but the real reckoning was just beginning. The weeks following the housewarming party passed in a strange, muted silence. Jim called me twice to thank me again for being so understanding about the party arrangements, and both times I found myself unable to tell him what had really happened that afternoon. How could I explain to my son that his wife had spent hours erasing my contribution to their happiness while I sat hidden in the kitchen I'd paid for? How could I burden him with the knowledge that the woman he loved saw his disabled mother as an embarrassment to be managed rather than family to be celebrated? Instead, I threw myself into my volunteer work at the Riverside Community Center, where I'd been coaching wheelchair basketball for local teens since my recovery had progressed enough to allow it. The kids didn't care about my limitations or see my wheelchair as something that needed to be hidden or managed. To them, I was Coach Elena, the woman who'd played college basketball before her construction career and who could still sink free throws with deadly accuracy despite being seated. Working with those teenagers reminded me that my value as a person wasn't diminished by my disability, even if my daughter-in-law seemed to believe otherwise. But the satisfaction I usually found in coaching felt hollow now, tainted by the growing realization of how thoroughly Ashley had manipulated the narrative of our family's recent history. Every time one of my players mentioned something about hard work paying off or achieving dreams through persistence, I thought about Ashley's performance at the party, her confident claims about months of saving and careful budgeting and delayed gratification. The lies had been so comprehensive, so detailed, that I began to wonder if she'd convinced herself they were true. Linda stopped by my house almost daily during those weeks, ostensibly to check on my recovery from what she called the kitchen incident, but really to express her ongoing outrage about Ashley's behavior. She'd appointed herself as my advocate, in a fight I wasn't sure I wanted to have, and her constant reminders of the injustice I'd suffered were both supportive and exhausting. "Elena, you can't just pretend this didn't happen," Linda said during one of her visits, settling into the chair across from my kitchen table with the determined expression of someone preparing for a lengthy lecture. "That woman stole credit for your generosity, lied to dozens of people about how she afforded those renovations, and treated you like hired help in a house you paid for. The longer you let this go unaddressed, the more normalized it becomes." I understood Linda's frustration, but I also understood the complexity of family dynamics in ways that her righteous anger couldn't accommodate. Jim was happy in his beautiful home with his wife and son, genuinely proud of what he believed they'd accomplished together. Ashley had created a version of reality that made her feel successful and deserving, and challenging that version would inevitably hurt people I loved. The question wasn't whether Ashley had wronged me, but whether exposing that wrong would cause more damage than allowing it to stand. 3 weeks after the party, Marcus called me on a Tuesday afternoon, his 8-year-old voice bubbling with excitement about a school project he was working on. He was supposed to write a report about someone in his family who'd overcome challenges, and he wanted to interview me about my accident and recovery. The innocence in his request broke something loose in my chest, and I found myself agreeing to help him, even though talking about the accident was still difficult for me. Marcus arrived at my house the following Saturday with a notebook and a list of carefully prepared questions, clearly taking his assignment seriously. We sat in my living room while he asked about my construction career, my accident, and the process of learning to navigate the world from a wheelchair. His questions were thoughtful and direct in the way that only children can manage, and I found myself telling him things I'd never shared with the adults in our family. "Grandma Elena, did you get money when you got hurt at work?" Marcus asked, his pencil poised over his notebook as he prepared to record my answer. "Yes, Marcus. When someone gets injured at work, there's usually insurance money to help them pay for medical bills and adapt to their new situation." He nodded seriously, making notes in his careful third-grade handwriting. "Mom says money is really important for families. She says that's why she and Dad worked so hard to save up for our new house." The casual reference to his parents' supposed financial sacrifice hit me like a physical blow. Ashley hadn't just lied to her party guests about funding the renovation. She'd been telling Marcus the same fabricated story, teaching him to take pride in achievements that weren't his family's, instilling in him a false understanding of how their current comfort had been obtained. "Marcus, what has your mom told you about the house renovation?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the anger building in my chest. "She said she and Dad saved money for a really long time so they could buy the house and make it beautiful," Marcus replied, his young face glowing with pride. "Mom says it shows what you can accomplish when you work hard and don't give up on your dreams. She says someday I'll be able to do the same thing when I'm grown up." The weight of Ashley's deception settled over me like a suffocating blanket. She wasn't just lying to friends and neighbors about her family's success. She was constructing an entirely false narrative for her son, teaching him to believe in a version of his family history that erased my contribution completely. Marcus would grow up thinking his parents had achieved their beautiful home through their own efforts, never knowing that his grandmother's catastrophic injury had made their dream possible. After Marcus left that afternoon, I sat in my living room staring at the notes he'd taken during our interview, thinking about the story he would write for his school project. He would describe my accident and recovery with the matter-of-fact resilience that children bring to difficult topics, but he would never connect my settlement money to his family's improved circumstances because he'd been systematically taught that those two events were unrelated. The phone rang around 8 o'clock that evening, and Jim's voice on the other end sounded strained and uncomfortable in a way that immediately put me on alert. "Mom, could you come over tomorrow? Ashley and I need to talk to you about something important." The formal tone of his request sent a chill through me. In all the years since Jim had gotten married, he'd never asked me to come over for a serious conversation without giving me some indication of what it might involve. The careful neutrality in his voice suggested that whatever Ashley wanted to discuss, it wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. I arrived at their house the next afternoon to find Ashley and Jim sitting at their dining room table with what appeared to be financial documents spread between them. Ashley's expression was businesslike and slightly defensive, while Jim looked uncomfortable and kept avoiding eye contact with me. The formal arrangement of the meeting, complete with prepared paperwork, made it clear that this wasn't going to be a casual family chat. "Elena, thank you for coming," Ashley said, her voice carrying the professional tone she might use for a business meeting. "Jim and I have been discussing our financial situation, and we need to address some issues related to the house purchase and renovation." I positioned my wheelchair at the table, noting how Ashley had arranged the documents so that she could easily reference them during whatever presentation she'd prepared. The calculated nature of the setup told me that this conversation had been rehearsed, that Ashley had specific goals she intended to achieve during our discussion. "We've been looking at our budget and our long-term financial planning," Ashley continued, "and we've realized that we need to formalize some of the arrangements we made when you helped us with the house." The euphemistic language she used, referring to my $85,000 gift as arrangements and help, immediately put me on guard. But I waited to hear what she had to say before responding, curious about what new version of reality she'd constructed to justify whatever she was about to propose. Jim finally spoke, his voice tight with discomfort. "Mom, We really appreciate everything you did to make our home purchase possible. But Ashley's right that we should have formal documentation of the financial aspects of our arrangement. Ashley spread several papers across the table, and I could see that they were loan documents, complete with interest rates and payment schedules and legal language about collateral and default terms. She'd apparently spent considerable time preparing a comprehensive financial agreement that would retroactively transform my gift into a business transaction. We want to set up a formal loan agreement, Ashley explained, her tone suggesting that this was a reasonable and responsible approach to our situation. We'll pay you back for the renovation costs over 10 years at a fair interest rate. That way, everyone's interests are protected, and we can treat this like the business transaction it should have been from the beginning. The documents she'd prepared were thorough and professional, clearly researched and drafted with considerable attention to legal detail. But what struck me most was the loan amount listed at the top of the first page, $42,000, exactly half of what I'd actually spent on their renovations. Ashley, the renovation costs were $85,000, not $42,000, I said, pointing to the figure on her paperwork. Her expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of something defensive in her eyes. We've been reviewing the actual costs, and we think some of the expenses you covered were beyond what we would have chosen to spend. The upgraded appliances, the premium countertops, some of the high-end finishes, those were your choices, not ours. We're willing to take responsibility for the basic renovation costs, but we don't think we should be obligated to repay you for upgrades we didn't request. The audacity of her position took my breath away. Ashley was sitting in a kitchen with custom cabinets and granite countertops and professional-grade appliances, preparing to formalize a loan agreement that would require her to repay less than half of what those improvements had actually cost, and justifying this arrangement by claiming that I'd made expensive choices without her input. Ashley, you selected every finish in this house, I said, my voice remaining calm despite the anger building in my chest. You chose the granite, the appliances, the cabinet hardware, the tile, everything. I have emails and text messages documenting your involvement in every decision. She waved her hand dismissively, as if my documentation of her participation was irrelevant to the conversation. Elena, I appreciate that you wanted to make sure we had nice things, but the reality is that we could have achieved the same basic functionality for much less money. We're willing to pay back what a reasonable renovation would have cost, but we can't take on debt for luxury items we never would have purchased ourselves. Jim looked increasingly uncomfortable as Ashley presented her revisionist version of the renovation process, but he didn't contradict her claims or defend my position. I realized that she'd already convinced him that her version of events was accurate, that I'd somehow imposed expensive upgrades on their renovation without their knowledge or consent. The loan documents Ashley had prepared included not only the reduced repayment amount, but also terms that would give them considerable flexibility in making payments. They could defer payments during financial hardship, adjust the payment schedule if their circumstances changed, and even negotiate a reduction in the total amount owed under certain conditions. It was less a loan agreement than a safety net that would protect them from any real obligation to repay me. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Ashley said, producing another set of documents from her folder. We've been advised that, for tax purposes, it would be better if the financial arrangement between us was documented as a loan from the beginning, rather than a gift that we're now formalizing. Our accountant says this approach will be more advantageous for everyone involved. The new documents she showed me were backdated to the time of the original house purchase, complete with signatures and notarization dates that would make it appear that we'd established a formal loan agreement before any money had changed hands. Ashley had apparently consulted with legal and financial professionals to construct a comprehensive fiction that would retroactively transform my gift into a business transaction with terms favorable to her family. Ashley, these documents are dated from last year, before we ever discussed any kind of loan arrangement, I pointed out. Our lawyer said it would be simpler to document the agreement as if it had existed from the beginning, she replied smoothly. It doesn't change the reality of what happened, just the paperwork trail for tax and legal purposes. But it did change the reality of what had happened, fundamentally and completely. In Ashley's revised version of our family history, I'd never made a generous gift to help my son's family achieve their dreams. Instead, I'd made a calculated financial investment with formal terms and legal protections and expectations of repayment, with interest. The emotional significance of my decision to use my settlement money to help them was erased, replaced by a business transaction that positioned Ashley and Jim as responsible borrowers, rather than recipients of extraordinary generosity. Jim finally spoke again, his voice carrying a note of pleading that suggested he understood how difficult this conversation was for me. Mom, we really think this is the best approach for everyone. It formalizes everything properly, protects your investment, and gives us a clear path to pay you back over time. Ashley's done a lot of research on this, and she thinks it's the most responsible way to handle the situation. The phrase, your investment, hit me like a slap. Jim was already adopting Ashley's language, already accepting her framework that transformed my gift into a financial transaction. In his mind, his wife was being responsible and professional by insisting on formal loan documentation, and I was being unreasonable if I objected to her approach. Ashley gathered the documents and presented them to me with a pen, her expression expectant and slightly impatient. If you could sign these today, we can get everything filed properly and start making regular payments next month. We've budgeted for the monthly payment amount, and we're committed to paying this back according to the agreed schedule. I stared at the papers in front of me, documents that would legally codify Ashley's alternative version of our family's recent history. Signing them would mean accepting that my decision to help Jim's family had been a business transaction rather than an act of love, that the $85,000 I'd spent on their renovation had been an investment rather than a gift, that Ashley's systematic erasure of my generosity was not only acceptable, but legally documented. The silence in the dining room stretched uncomfortably as Ashley and Jim waited for me to sign the loan agreements. Ashley's foot tapped impatiently under the table, and Jim kept glancing between his wife and his mother with growing anxiety. The pressure to cooperate, to be the reasonable and accommodating family member, was almost overwhelming. But as I sat in my wheelchair at their dining room table, surrounded by the beautiful renovations my money had paid for, listening to Ashley's careful justifications for why she should only have to repay half of what I'd spent, while simultaneously erasing the generous spirit in which that money had been given, something crystallized in my understanding of the situation. This wasn't about loan documentation or tax advantages or financial responsibility. This was about Ashley's need to control the narrative of her family's success, to eliminate any version of their story that didn't cast her and Jim as the architects of their own good fortune. She couldn't tolerate the idea that their beautiful home had been made possible by Jim's disabled mother's sacrifice, so she was systematically rewriting history to eliminate that uncomfortable truth. The loan agreement wasn't just a financial document. It was the final step in Ashley's comprehensive erasure of my contribution to her family's happiness, a legal seal on her fiction that would make it impossible for anyone to contradict her version of events. Once I signed those papers, she would have successfully transformed my gift into her achievement, my generosity into her responsible financial management, my love into her business acumen. I set the pen down without signing anything and looked directly at Ashley for the first time since entering their house that afternoon. I need some time to think about this. Her expression immediately shifted from expectant to annoyed. Elena, this is really quite straightforward. We're offering to pay you back with interest for money you lent us. I'm not sure what there is to think about. The ease with which she slipped into referring to my gift as money I'd lent them confirmed everything I'd begun to suspect about her motivations. In Ashley's mind, the loan agreement wasn't creating a new financial arrangement. It was simply documenting what she'd always believed to be true, that I'd given them money because I expected to be repaid, not because I loved them and wanted them to be happy. I wheeled away from the dining room table without signing the documents, leaving Ashley and Jim sitting with their carefully prepared paperwork and their rehearsed explanations. The drive home felt longer than usual, and by the time I reached my house on Maple Street, I understood that my relationship with my son's family had reached a point of no return. That evening, I called Linda and asked her to come over as soon as possible. When she arrived, I showed her the loan documents Ashley had prepared and explained the afternoon's conversation in detail. Linda's reaction was immediate and explosive, her voice rising with each new detail I shared about Ashley's proposed arrangement. "Elena, this woman is unbelievable," Linda said, pacing around my living room with the loan papers clutched in her fist. "She's not just stealing credit for your generosity anymore. She's trying to legally erase it, to create documentation that will support her lies for years to come. And she's doing it while cutting the amount she'd have to repay in half." I sat in my wheelchair watching Linda's fury, feeling strangely detached from her outrage. The betrayal was so complete, so comprehensive, that I'd moved beyond anger into something colder and more calculating. Ashley had shown me exactly who she was, had revealed the extent of her selfishness and manipulation, and now I needed to decide what I was going to do with that knowledge. "Linda, I think it's time I had a serious conversation with a lawyer," I said quietly. Her pacing stopped immediately, and she turned to face me with an expression of surprise and approval. "Elena, it's about time. What Ashley's doing isn't just morally wrong, it's potentially illegal. Fraud, maybe, or some kind of financial elder abuse. You need someone who understands the law to help you figure out your options." That night, I lay in bed thinking about the $85,000 I'd given to Jim's family, money that had come to me because my spine had been crushed by falling steel, money that was supposed to help me adapt to a life I'd never chosen. I'd use that money to give my son's family something beautiful, something lasting, something that would shelter and comfort them for years to come. But Ashley had taken my gift and transformed it into something ugly, something that diminished both the giver and the recipients. The settlement money had been meant to compensate me for a life-changing injury, but I'd found meaning in using it to change my family's life for the better. Ashley had stolen that meaning, erased that purpose, and replaced it with a business transaction that served only her need to control the narrative of her success. She'd taken the most generous thing I'd ever done and turned it into just another financial arrangement with terms that favored her interests. As I finally drifted off to sleep that night, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to sign Ashley's loan documents. I wasn't going to accept her version of events, and I wasn't going to let her steal the story of my generosity without a fight. The real battle was just beginning. The law office of Thompson and Associates occupied the second floor of a renovated Victorian house downtown, and I was grateful to discover that they'd installed a modern elevator alongside the original wooden staircase. Michael Thompson met me in the lobby, a man in his early 50s with kind eyes and the sort of patient demeanor that immediately put me at ease. Linda had recommended him specifically because of his experience with elder law and family financial disputes, and she'd assured me that he wouldn't treat my concerns as trivial or emotional overreactions. "Mrs. Martinez, Linda Chen spoke very highly of you when she called to arrange this appointment," Michael said as he guided me into his office, a comfortable space lined with law books and family photos. "She mentioned that you're dealing with some complex family financial issues that need legal clarification." I'd spent the weekend preparing for this meeting, gathering every document related to the house purchase and renovation, bank statements, showing the wire transfers I'd made, receipts from contractors, email exchanges with Ashley about design choices, and the backdated loan agreements she'd presented to me. The evidence of my financial contribution was overwhelming and indisputable, but I wasn't sure how to explain the emotional complexity of the situation to someone who didn't know our family dynamics. "Mr. Thompson, 8 months ago, I used my workers' compensation settlement to help my son and daughter-in-law purchase and renovate a home. I began, placing the folder of documents on his desk. I gave them $85,000 as a gift, with no expectation of repayment. Last week, my daughter-in-law presented me with loan documents that would formalize this as a business transaction and reduce the amount I'm owed to $42,000. Michael opened the folder and began examining the documents, his expression growing more focused as he reviewed the bank statements and contractor receipts. When he reached Ashley's proposed loan agreements, his eyebrows rose significantly, and he spent several minutes studying the terms and the backdated signatures. Mrs. Martinez, these loan documents are quite concerning from a legal standpoint, he said finally. The backdating alone raises serious questions about fraud, but the bigger issue is what appears to be an attempt to retroactively change the nature of a financial gift without your consent. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making notes as I explained the full scope of Ashley's behavior. The housewarming party where she'd claimed credit for the renovations, her systematic lies to friends and neighbors about how they'd funded, the improvements, and her recent attempt to create legal documentation that would support her false narrative while reducing her obligation to me. What troubles me most is the comprehensive nature of this deception, Michael said, tapping his pen against the desk as he considered the implications. Your daughter-in-law isn't just trying to avoid repaying you. She's constructing an elaborate fiction about her family's finances, and she wants legal documentation that will make that fiction appear legitimate. I described Ashley's performance at the housewarming party in detail, explaining how she'd spent hours telling guests about the months of saving and budgeting that had supposedly made their renovation possible. Michael listened with growing concern, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific claims Ashley had made or particular guests who'd heard her false stories. Mrs. Martinez, what your daughter-in-law is doing could potentially constitute several different types of fraud, Michael explained. She's making false statements about material facts to third parties. She's attempting to create fraudulent legal documents, and she may be engaging in what we call financial elder abuse if she's trying to coerce or manipulate you into signing agreements that aren't in your best interest. The term elder abuse hit me like a cold shock. I'd been thinking of Ashley's behavior as selfish and dishonest, but I hadn't considered that it might rise to the level of legal abuse. The idea that my own daughter-in-law might be guilty of abusing me felt both validating and devastating. Confirmation that my instincts about her behavior had been correct, but also acknowledgement of how thoroughly she'd betrayed my trust. Michael spent the next hour explaining my legal options, and the possibilities were both encouraging and daunting. I could file a civil lawsuit to recover the full amount I'd spent on the renovation, plus damages for the emotional distress Ashley's lies had caused. I could report her attempt to create fraudulent loan documents to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. I could seek a restraining order preventing her from making false statements about our financial arrangements to third parties. The strength of your case is quite remarkable, Michael said, gesturing toward the stack of evidence I'd provided. You have clear documentation of every dollar you spent, proof of your daughter-in-law's involvement in choosing the upgrades she now claims were unnecessary, and written evidence of her attempt to create backdated legal agreements. Most financial disputes involve much more ambiguous circumstances, but even as Michael outlined the legal weapons at my disposal, I found myself thinking about the collateral damage that any legal action would inevitably cause. Jim would be caught in the middle of a battle between his wife and his mother, forced to choose sides in a conflict that would likely destroy our family relationships permanently. Marcus would grow up knowing that his grandmother had sued his parents, that his childhood home had been the subject of bitter legal disputes, that his family had been torn apart by money and lies. Mr. Thompson, what happens to my son and grandson if I pursue legal action against Ashley? His expression grew thoughtful and sympathetic. That's always the most difficult aspect of family financial disputes, Mrs. Martinez. The legal system can address the financial and fraudulent aspects of your situation quite effectively, but it can't repair the emotional damage that leads to these conflicts or prevent the additional trauma that litigation often causes. Michael recommended that we start with a formal demand letter, clearly stating my position and giving Ashley an opportunity to resolve the situation without court involvement. The letter would document her fraudulent claims, demand acknowledgement of the true nature of my financial contribution, and require her to stop making false statements about their renovation funding. If she refused to cooperate, we would have established a clear record of our attempts to resolve the matter amicably before pursuing more aggressive legal action. I want to give you some time to think about how you'd like to proceed, Michael said as our meeting concluded. This is ultimately about more than money. It's about your dignity, your family relationships, and your right to have your generosity acknowledged rather than stolen. Those are deeply personal considerations that only you can weigh. I left Michael's office with a clearer understanding of my legal options, but no immediate clarity about which path I wanted to pursue. The drive home took me past Jim's house on Oak Ridge Drive, and I found myself slowing down to look at the beautiful exterior that my money had helped create. The landscaping was coming along nicely, and I could see Ashley's car in the driveway, probably inside the house she was still claiming to have funded through her own hard work and financial sacrifice. That evening, Frank Rodriguez called to check on how I was handling the aftermath of what he'd witnessed at the housewarming party. His anger about Ashley's behavior hadn't diminished in the weeks since that afternoon, and he'd been encouraging me to take some kind of action to address her lies and manipulation. Elena, I've been thinking about what happened at that party, and I keep coming back to something that really bothers me, Frank said, his voice tight with suppressed frustration. That woman didn't just lie about paying for those renovations. She performed those lies for hours in front of dozens of people while you sat hidden in the kitchen. It was calculated and cruel, and it was designed to steal credit for your sacrifice. I told Frank about my meeting with Michael Thompson and the legal options we'd discussed, and his response was immediate and emphatic. Elena, you have to fight this. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever been taken advantage of by family members who think they can get away with it, because the victim won't want to cause family drama. Frank's perspective was valuable because he understood both the financial and emotional significance of my settlement money. He'd watched me struggle with the decision to use those funds to help Jim's family, knowing that the money represented compensation for a life-altering injury that had ended my construction career and changed everything about my daily existence. He'd seen how much meaning I'd found in using that money to give my family something beautiful, and he understood how completely Ashley had corrupted that meaning with her lies and manipulation. You know what really gets me? Frank continued. That woman is sitting in a house you bought, using appliances you paid for, entertaining guests in a kitchen you funded, and telling everyone who'll listen about how she and Jim accomplished all this through their own efforts. She's not just stealing your money, Elena. She's stealing your story. The phrase, stealing your story, resonated with something deep in my chest, a recognition of what Ashley's behavior had really cost me. The money was important, but the real theft had been the erasure of my generosity, the transformation of my gift into her achievement, the systematic denial of my contribution to her family's happiness. She'd taken the most meaningful thing I'd done since my accident and made it invisible, replacing it with a fiction that served only her need to appear successful and self-sufficient. Over the next few days, I found myself paying closer attention to the conversations happening around me at the community center, listening to how people talked about family obligations and generosity and the complex dynamics of helping children. Several of the other wheelchair basketball coaches were dealing with their own family financial issues, and I began to understand that my situation with Ashley wasn't unique, just more extreme than most. Maria Santos, who coached the girls' team, had recently helped her daughter buy a car, only to discover that the daughter was telling her friends she'd saved up for the purchase herself. David Kim had contributed to his son's wedding expenses, but the son's new wife insisted on taking credit for the elaborate celebration they'd been able to afford. These stories of erased generosity and stolen credit seemed disturbingly common, as if acknowledging help from aging parents was somehow incompatible with adult independence and success. Elena, the problem is that some people can't accept help without feeling diminished by it, Maria explained during one of our conversations after practice. So they rewrite the story to make themselves the hero, even if it means erasing the person who actually helped them. It's not just dishonest, it's emotionally abusive to the person whose generosity gets stolen. The phrase, emotionally abusive, was one I'd been reluctant to apply to Ashley's behavior, but the more I thought about it, the more accurate it seemed. She hadn't just lied about our financial arrangements. She'd systematically undermined my sense of my own contribution to our family's well-being, making me question whether my generosity had been welcome or burdensome, whether my involvement in the renovation had been helpful or intrusive, whether my presence at family gatherings was valued or merely tolerated. A week after my meeting with Michael Thompson, Ashley called me unexpectedly, her voice carrying a tone of frustrated impatience that suggested she'd been waiting for me to contact her about the loan documents. "Elena, Jim and I are still waiting for you to sign the paperwork we discussed," she said without any preliminary pleasantries. "Our accountant needs those documents filed before the end of the month for tax purposes, and we can't complete our financial planning until we have your signature." The casual way she referred to the fraudulent loan agreements as simple paperwork revealed how completely she'd convinced herself that her version of events was legitimate. In Ashley's mind, I was being unreasonably difficult by failing to sign documents that would formalize what she believed to be the true nature of our financial arrangement. I was touched that she wanted to celebrate what we'd accomplished together, and I looked forward to seeing our friends' and neighbors' reactions to the transformation. The party was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in late spring, when the weather would be perfect for guests to spill out onto the new back deck that overlooked their landscaped yard. Ashley had invited everyone from Jim's co-workers to our neighbors from Maple Street to Marcus's teachers and classmates' parents. It was going to be a real celebration of their new chapter, and I spent the week before the party imagining how proud I'd feel watching my family host their first big gathering in the home that love had built. I should have realized that Ashley's perfectionist tendencies, which had served us so well during the renovation, might become a source of stress when it came to entertaining. I should have noticed the way she obsessed over every detail of the party planning, the way she practiced her tour of the house for anyone who would listen, the way she checked and rechecked the guest list and the catering order and the weather forecast. But I was so focused on my own excitement about the celebration that I missed the signs of her growing anxiety about everything being absolutely perfect. The morning of the party, I spent extra time getting ready, choosing a bright blue blouse that Ashley had complimented before and making sure my wheelchair was clean and polished. I'd even bought a new purse that matched my outfit, something I rarely bothered with anymore, but that felt appropriate for such a special occasion. I was proud of what we'd accomplished together, proud of the home we'd created for my family, and I wanted to look my best for the celebration. I arrived at the house 30 minutes before the party was scheduled to start, wanting to help Ashley with any last-minute preparations and to see how everything looked before the guests arrived. The transformation from the house I'd visited during renovation to the house dressed for a party was remarkable. Ashley had clearly spent hours arranging flowers and adjusting lighting and making sure every surface gleamed. The whole place looked like it was ready for a magazine photo shoot. But the moment I wheeled through the front door, I knew something was wrong. Ashley's smile was too bright, too forced, and there was something in her eyes that made my stomach clench with sudden anxiety. She greeted me with the kind of enthusiastic hello that people use when they're trying too hard to seem normal, and I noticed how her gaze flickered from my face to my wheelchair and back again, like she was calculating something in her head. "Elena, you look lovely," she said, but her voice had a strained quality that I'd never heard before. "I'm so glad you're here early. I wanted to talk to you about something before everyone else arrives." The cold feeling in my stomach intensified. Ashley led me into the living room, where every piece of furniture had been arranged for optimal entertaining flow, where every surface had been cleared of the family photos and everyday clutter that normally made a house feel lived in. It looked beautiful but somehow sterile, like a display home rather than the warm family space I'd envisioned during the renovation. "Elena, I need to ask you a favor," Ashley began, her hands twisting together in front of her. "I know this might sound silly, but I've worked so hard to make everything perfect for today, and I'm just worried about the logistics of having everyone moving around the house comfortably." I waited for her to continue, though I was already beginning to understand where this conversation was heading. "The thing is, with your wheelchair, it's going to be difficult for people to move around easily, especially when we're giving tours of the house. And I know some of our guests aren't used to being around people with disabilities, and I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable or awkward." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at Ashley, this woman I'd grown closer to over the past few months, this woman whose dream home I'd made possible with my own money, and tried to process what she was actually saying to me. "What exactly are you asking me to do, Ashley?" She took a deep breath, like she was steeling herself for something difficult. "I was wondering if maybe you could stay in the kitchen during the party. You'd still be here, of course, still part of the celebration, but you'd be out of the main flow of traffic. I could bring people to visit with you there, and you'd be more comfortable not having to navigate around all the guests." The kitchen. She wanted me to stay in the kitchen, out of sight, while she showed off the house that I had paid for, the renovations that I had made possible, the dream that I had helped her achieve. She wanted me hidden away like an embarrassment, like something that might spoil the perfect image she was trying to project to her guests. I looked around the living room that I'd watched take shape from bare studs to finished beauty, at the hardwood floors I'd helped select, at the paint colors Ashley and I had chosen together during those long afternoons at the construction site. I thought about the conversations we'd had during the renovation, the excitement we'd shared, the bond I'd thought we'd formed over creating something special for our family. "Ashley," I said quietly, "do you remember who paid for all of this?" Her face flushed red, but her expression remained determined. "Of course I remember, and I'm grateful. I really am. But this party is important to me, Elena. I need it to go perfectly. I need people to see us as successful, as the kind of family who belongs in a house like this. And having a wheelchair in the middle of everything just complicates that image." There it was. I thought about what it meant to build something lasting, something that would shelter the people you love. The next morning, I called my bank and asked about wire transfers. I didn't tell Jim what I was planning. Instead, I called him that evening and said I'd been thinking about the house they'd shown me and that I wanted to make them a proposition. Could they meet me for lunch at Pete's Place downtown so we could talk? Pete's Place was one of those classic small-town diners where the coffee was always hot, and the waitresses had been working there long enough to remember your usual order. I'd been going there since Jim was in high school, and now it was one of the few restaurants in Riverside that was fully wheelchair accessible, which made it an easy choice for family meetings. Jim and Ashley slid into the booth across from me, both looking curious and slightly worried about what I might want to discuss. "I've been thinking about that house," I said after we'd ordered our food, "and I want to help you buy it." Jim immediately started shaking his head. "Mom, we can't let you do that. You need your money for your medical expenses and modifications to your house, and—" I held up my hand to stop him. "Let me finish. I'm not talking about giving you money. I'm talking about investing in my family's future. I want to buy that house, fix it up the right way, and then you can pay me back over time like a private mortgage. No bank fees, no credit checks, just family helping family." Ashley's eyes went wide. "Elena, that's incredibly generous, but we couldn't possibly—" "You could and you will," I said firmly. "I know construction, I know contractors, and I know quality work when I see it. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. New kitchen, updated bathrooms, hardwood, floors, the works. I want Marcus growing up in a house that's worthy of him." The conversation went on for another hour, with both Jim and Ashley trying to talk me out of what they saw as an overly generous gesture. But I'd made up my mind. I had the money, I had the knowledge to oversee the renovations, and most importantly, I had the desire to give my family something meaningful. The workers' compensation settlement had been intended to help me adapt to my new limitations, but using it to help my son's family thrive felt like the most adaptive thing I could possibly do. 3 weeks later, we closed on the house. I put down the full purchase price plus an additional $85,000 for renovations, working directly with contractors I'd known for years to ensure every detail was perfect. Ashley threw herself into choosing paint colors and tile patterns and cabinet hardware, and I loved watching her excitement as her dream kitchen took shape. Jim insisted on helping with the manual labor on evenings and weekends, and even Marcus got involved by helping his grandmother pick out the perfect shade of blue for his new bedroom. The renovation took 4 months, and every week brought new progress. I visited the construction site daily, my wheelchair navigating easily through the wide doorways and open floor plan we'd designed. Ashley would meet me there after dropping Marcus at school, and we'd walk through the latest updates together, discussing everything from light fixture placement to the pros and cons of different countertop materials. Those months brought Ashley and me closer than we'd ever been, bonded by the shared vision of creating something beautiful for our family. I made one request during the renovation process. I asked the contractors to build a small ramp at the side entrance to the house, making it wheelchair accessible without being obvious from the front curb appeal. Ashley assumed it was for my visits, and I let her believe that. But truthfully, I was thinking about the future, about the possibility that someday other family members might need that accessibility. You learn to think ahead about these things when mobility becomes a daily consideration. When the renovation was finally complete, the transformation was stunning. The outdated 1980s house had become a modern family home with an open-concept kitchen and living area, gleaming hardwood floors throughout, and bathrooms that looked like they belonged in a home design magazine. Ashley cried when she saw the finished kitchen with its white cabinets and quartz countertops, and the large island where she could prep meals while keeping an eye on Marcus doing homework at the breakfast bar. Jim tried to talk to me about repayment terms, about setting up a formal loan agreement with monthly payments, but I kept putting off those conversations. The truth was, seeing my family happy in their beautiful new home was payment enough for me. I'd found a way to use my settlement money that gave me more satisfaction than any interest rate ever could. Ashley started planning a housewarming party, almost immediately, wanting to show off their beautiful new space to friends and family. She threw herself into the party planning with the same enthusiasm she'd shown for the renovation, ordering custom invitations and researching catering options, and creating Pinterest boards full of decoration ideas. "Ashley, I've decided not to sign those documents," I said, my voice steady despite the anxiety I felt about confronting her directly. The silence that followed was long enough that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Ashley finally spoke, her tone had shifted from impatient to angry. "Elena, I don't understand what the problem is. We're offering to pay you back with interest for money you lent us. This is a fair and reasonable arrangement that protects everyone's interests." The ease with which she slipped into describing my gift as money I'd lent them confirmed everything Michael Thompson had warned me about. Ashley had so thoroughly internalized her false narrative that she genuinely seemed to believe it was true, or at least she'd become so committed to maintaining it that admitting the truth was no longer psychologically possible for her. "Ashley, I didn't lend you money. I gave you $85,000 as a gift to help your family purchase and renovate a home. There was never any discussion of repayment, interest rates, or loan terms." Her voice became sharp and defensive. "Elena, that's not how Jim and I understood the arrangement. We always intended to pay you back once we were financially stable." We assumed you knew that we wouldn't just take such a large amount of money without any plan for repayment. The revisionist history she was creating in real time was breathtaking in its audacity. Ashley was literally rewriting our conversations from 8 months earlier, claiming that discussions about repayment had taken place when we both knew they hadn't, insisting that her current financial obligations had been implicit in our original arrangement. Ashley, I have emails and text messages documenting our conversations about the house purchase and renovation. Nowhere in any of those communications did you or Jim mention repayment, loan terms, or any expectation that this was anything other than a gift. Those communications don't capture the full context of our discussions, she replied smoothly. There were verbal understandings that aren't reflected in the written record. Jim and I always knew this was a temporary financial arrangement that we'd formalize once the renovation was complete. The sophistication of her lies was almost impressive. Ashley was constructing a comprehensive alternative history that couldn't be definitively disproven because it relied on claiming that important conversations had taken place privately, without witnesses or documentation. She was essentially asking me to accept that my own memory of our arrangements was incorrect, that her current version of events reflected discussions I'd somehow forgotten or misunderstood. Ashley, I'm not going to sign loan documents for money I gave you as a sow. Her tone shifted again, becoming more aggressive and threatening. Elena, Jim, and I have been very patient with you, but we can't allow this financial uncertainty to continue indefinitely. If you won't cooperate with a reasonable repayment arrangement, we may need to explore other legal options to resolve this situation. The implied threat was clear. If I wouldn't accept her terms, she was prepared to take legal action against me. The irony was staggering. Ashley was threatening to sue me for refusing to sign fraudulent documents that would formalize her theft of credit for my generosity, while simultaneously demanding that I accept repayment of only half the money I'd actually given her. I think we should end this conversation here, Ashley, I said, recognizing that further discussion would only give her more opportunities to make threats or create additional false narratives about our arrangement. After hanging up, I sat in my living room thinking about the woman my son had married, trying to reconcile the Ashley I'd thought I knew with the person who'd just threatened legal action because I wouldn't cooperate with her attempts to steal credit for my gift. The transformation seemed almost complete. The grateful daughter-in-law who'd worked closely with me to plan the renovation had been replaced by someone who saw me as an obstacle to her preferred version of reality. That evening, I called Michael Thompson and asked him to prepare the demand letter we'd discussed. The time for trying to preserve family harmony had passed. Ashley had made it clear that she wasn't going to acknowledge the truth about our financial arrangements voluntarily, and her threat of legal action against me had eliminated any remaining hope for an amicable resolution. Mrs. Martinez, I think you're making the right decision, Michael said when I explained Ashley's threats. Your daughter-in-law's behavior has escalated from dishonest to potentially criminal. The demand letter will establish a clear record of your position and give her one final opportunity to resolve this matter without court involvement. Michael's demand letter was comprehensive and devastating, documenting every aspect of Ashley's fraudulent behavior with references to specific evidence and legal precedents. It demanded that she acknowledge the true nature of my financial contribution, stop making false statements about their renovation funding, and cease all attempts to create fraudulent legal documentation of our arrangement. The letter gave her 30 days to respond, after which we would pursue civil and potentially criminal legal action. The beauty of this approach is that it forces your daughter-in-law to make a choice, Michael explained. She can acknowledge the truth and accept the consequences of her lies, or she can double down on her fraudulent claims and face the full weight of the legal system. But the truth is, I was protecting my own ego. I wanted people to see me as successful and capable, and I was willing to steal credit for your sacrifice to maintain that image. Ashley's acknowledgement of her true motivations was more honest than I'd expected, and I could see that Jim's confrontation had forced her to face some uncomfortable truths about herself and her behavior. "The loan documents were the worst part," she continued, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "I knew they were fraudulent. I knew I was trying to cheat you out of money you'd given us freely. But I'd gotten so deep into the lie that I couldn't figure out how to get out of it without admitting everything I'd done wrong." "Ashley, why didn't you just acknowledge my contribution from the beginning? Why create such an elaborate deception?" She was quiet for a long moment, considering. Her answer: "Because acknowledging your help would have meant admitting that Jim and I weren't as successful as I wanted people to think we were. I wanted to be the kind of woman who could provide her family with a beautiful home through her own efforts, not someone who needed charity from her husband's disabled mother." The word charity stung, revealing how Ashley had truly viewed my gift despite all her recent apologies and acknowledgments of wrongdoing. In her mind, my generosity had been something shameful that diminished her family's accomplishments rather than something meaningful that had enhanced their opportunities. "Elena, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway," Ashley said, her voice breaking with genuine emotion. "Jim is talking about separation, and I know that's probably what I deserve, but I don't want Marcus to grow up in a broken home because of my lies and selfishness." The mention of Marcus brought the conversation into sharper focus. Whatever Ashley had done to me, whatever lies she'd told or credit she'd stolen, there was an 8-year-old boy whose life would be significantly impacted by the consequences of her choices. Jim was my son, and I would support whatever decisions he made about his marriage, but Marcus was innocent of his mother's deceptions and didn't deserve to have his childhood destroyed by adult financial manipulations. "Ashley, my forgiveness isn't what's going to save your marriage," I said gently. "Jim's trust has been broken, and that's something only you and he can work to repair. But I will say this: if you're genuinely committed to making amends, you need to start by telling Marcus the truth about how his family was able to afford their home." Ashley looked stricken at the suggestion. "Elena, he's only 8 years old. How do I explain to him that everything I've told him about our success was a lie? You tell him that his grandmother used her accident settlement money to help his family buy their house because she loves them and wanted them to have something beautiful. You tell him that sometimes adults make mistakes when they're embarrassed about needing help, but that accepting help from people who love you isn't something to be ashamed of." Over the following weeks, Ashley followed through on the public acknowledgments that Jim had demanded. She contacted everyone who'd attended the housewarming party, explaining that she'd misrepresented how they'd funded their renovations, and acknowledging that Jim's mother had made their dream home possible through an extraordinary act of generosity. The conversations were undoubtedly humiliating for her, but she completed them all without complaint or attempts to minimize her deception. She also wrote me a formal letter of apology that was comprehensive and unflinching in its acknowledgement of her wrongdoing. The letter detailed every lie she'd told, every instance of stolen credit, and every attempt to manipulate our financial arrangements to her advantage. More importantly, it included a full acknowledgement of the meaning and significance of my gift, recognizing that my decision to use my settlement money to help their family had been an act of love that deserved gratitude and respect rather than erasure and exploitation. Jim and Ashley began marriage counseling, working with a therapist who specialized in financial deception and family trust issues. The process was difficult and painful, with no guarantee that their relationship could survive the comprehensive betrayal that Ashley's lies had represented. But they were both committed to trying, if not for their own sake, then for Marcus's well-being and future stability. 6 months after the housewarming party that had revealed the full extent of Ashley's deception, I received an invitation to a very different kind of gathering at Jim's house. This time, the purpose was explicit, a celebration specifically honoring my contribution to their family's happiness, with Ashley publicly acknowledging my generosity in front of the same friends and neighbors who'd heard her lies months earlier. The event was small and intimate, Nothing like the elaborate housewarming party Ashley had orchestrated to showcase her supposed success. But the atmosphere was warmer and more genuine, with guests who understood the true story of the house they were gathered in and who wanted to express their admiration for the sacrifice I'd made to help my family achieve their dreams. Ashley stood in the living room that my money had renovated and delivered a speech that was remarkable for its honesty and humility. She acknowledged her lies publicly, apologized for the deception she'd practiced, and gave full credit to me for making their beautiful home possible. The speech was clearly difficult for her to give, but she delivered it with sincerity and without any attempts to justify or minimize her previous behavior. 8 months ago, Elena Martinez used her workers' compensation settlement to give our family the most generous gift we've ever received, Ashley said, her voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind her words. She made it possible for us to buy this house and renovate it into the home where Marcus will grow up. Everything you see around you, from the kitchen where we cook our meals to the floors we walk on, exists because of Elena's love and sacrifice. She paused, looking directly at me where I sat in my wheelchair near the front of the gathered group. I failed to acknowledge Elena's generosity properly when we first celebrated this house, and I compounded that failure with lies and deception that I will regret for the rest of my life. Either way, her pattern of deception and manipulation will be exposed. I left Michael's office that day feeling something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of agency and empowerment. For too long, I'd allowed Ashley to control the narrative of our family's recent history, to steal credit for my generosity, and to treat me as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person deserving of respect and acknowledgement. But now I had legal representation, comprehensive evidence, and a clear plan for fighting back against her systematic abuse. The demand letter was delivered to Ashley and Jim's house on a Tuesday morning, and by that afternoon, my phone was ringing, with Jim's panicked voice on the other end. "Mom, what is this legal letter Ashley showed me? What's happening here?" The confusion and distress in his voice broke my heart, but I also heard something else. Genuine surprise. Jim clearly had no idea that his wife had been lying about their renovation funding or attempting to create fraudulent loan documents. Ashley had apparently been conducting her campaign of deception without his knowledge or consent, which meant that my legal action might actually protect him from the consequences of her behavior rather than punish him for it. "Jim, I think it's time you and I had a long conversation about what really happened with your house purchase and renovation," I said gently. "There are some things you need to know about the choices your wife has been making. The reckoning I'd been avoiding for months was finally at hand, and for the first time since the housewarming party, I felt ready to face whatever came next." Jim arrived at my house less than an hour after our phone conversation, still clutching the legal demand letter that had shattered his understanding of his family's recent history. His face was pale with shock and confusion, and I could see that he'd been crying during the drive from his house to mine. The man who walked through my front door looked nothing like the confident, happy homeowner who'd hosted the housewarming party just weeks earlier. "Mom, I don't understand any of this," he said, sinking into the chair across from my kitchen table where we'd had so many family conversations over the years. "This letter talks about fraud and elder abuse and criminal charges. It says Ashley's been lying about how we paid for the house renovations. None of this makes sense to me." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised alone after his father died, this person I loved more than anyone else in the world, and realized that he genuinely had no idea what his wife had been doing. Ashley had conducted her entire campaign of deception without Jim's knowledge, lying not just to their friends and neighbors, but to her own husband about the nature of our financial arrangements. "Jim, when I gave you the money for the house purchase and renovations, what did you understand that to be?" His answer came immediately, without hesitation. "It was a gift, Mom. An incredibly generous gift that made it possible for us to give Marcus the kind of home we'd always dreamed of providing for him. I've been grateful every single day since we moved in, knowing that you used your settlement money to help us when you could have used it for so many other things. The relief that flooded through me at hearing his words was overwhelming. Jim understood exactly what had happened between us. He recognized and appreciated the nature of my gift, which meant that Ashley's lies and manipulations had been conducted entirely without his consent or knowledge. Jim, 3 weeks ago, Ashley presented me with loan documents that would formalize my gift as a business transaction and reduce the amount I'd supposedly lent you to $42,000 instead of the $85,000 I actually spent. His mouth fell open in shock. She what? Mom, we never discussed anything like that. I had no idea Ashley was even thinking about loan agreements or repayment schedules or any of that. I pulled out the folder of documents I'd shown to Michael. Thompson and spread them across the kitchen table, explaining Ashley's proposed loan terms and her attempts to create backdated legal agreements that would support her false narrative. Jim's expression grew more horrified with each detail I revealed, and I could see him beginning to understand the full scope of his wife's deception. The backdated signatures, the reduced loan amount, the claims about tax advantages, all of that was Ashley's idea? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. All of it, Jim, and there's more you need to know. I told him about the housewarming party, describing in detail how Ashley had spent hours claiming credit for renovations she hadn't funded, telling guests elaborate stories about months of saving and budgeting that had never happened, positioning herself and Jim as successful homeowners who'd achieved their dream through their own hard work and financial sacrifice. She told everyone we saved for 2 years to afford the renovation, I explained. She said you took on freelance projects to pay for the granite countertops. She described careful research into every upgrade and improvement, as if you'd both been involved in making financial decisions about work that I actually paid for. Jim buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with what I realized were sobs of shame and disbelief. Mom, I swear to you, I had no idea she was saying any of those things. When people at the party complimented us on the house, I just assumed they understood that you'd helped us. But I want everyone here to understand that this home, this family's happiness, this child's secure and beautiful childhood, all of it is possible because Elena Martinez chose to use the most difficult chapter of her own life to write a better story for the people she loves. The applause that followed Ashley's speech was warm and sustained, and I found myself wiping tears from my eyes as I looked around the room at faces that now understood the true story of how this gathering had become possible. But more than the public acknowledgement, what moved me most was seeing Marcus beam with pride as he learned the full truth about his grandmother's role in creating his family's happiness. After the other guests had gone home, Marcus approached me with a handmade card he'd created at school. The front featured a drawing of a house with a wheelchair ramp, and inside he'd written in his careful third-grade handwriting, "Thank you, Grandma Elena, for making our house beautiful and for showing me that helping people you love is the most important thing you can do." Jim found me in the kitchen later that evening, both of us exhausted by the emotional intensity of the day, but also relieved that the truth had finally been acknowledged publicly and completely. Mom, I know Ashley's behavior caused tremendous pain, and I know the damage to our family relationships may never be completely healed, he said, settling into the chair beside my wheelchair. But I want you to know that your generosity didn't just give us a house. It gave us an example of what real love looks like, what it means to sacrifice for family, what it means to find meaning in helping others achieve their dreams. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. Ashley's lies and manipulation had caused real harm, creating months of pain and family conflict that could have been avoided if she'd simply acknowledged the truth from the beginning. But the resolution of our conflict had also revealed important truths about the strength of my relationship with Jim, the resilience of our family bonds, and the ultimate power of honesty over deception. The workers' compensation settlement I'd received after my accident, had been intended to help me adapt to a life I'd never chosen. But using that money to help my family had given me something more valuable than financial security. It had given me the knowledge that my sacrifice had created something lasting and beautiful, that my love had been transformed into shelter and comfort, and opportunity for the people I cared about most. 6 months later, I established the Elena Martinez Foundation, using the remainder of my settlement money to help other families navigate the complex challenges of disability, family financial crises, and elder care issues. The foundation provided grants for home modifications, legal assistance for families dealing with financial exploitation, and educational resources about recognizing and preventing elder abuse. Ashley surprised everyone by becoming one of the foundation's most dedicated volunteers, using her experience with deception and manipulation to help educate other families about the warning signs of financial abuse. Her transformation wasn't complete or perfect, and the trust issues in her marriage continued to require ongoing work, but she'd found a way to turn her mistakes into something constructive and helpful for others. The foundation's first major initiative was a workshop series called Dignity and Truth in Family Financial Relationships, which provided families with tools for having honest conversations about money, gifts, and intergenerational support. The workshops were popular with both seniors and their adult children, many of whom had never learned how to navigate the complex emotions surrounding financial help between generations. At the Foundation's first annual dinner, I spoke to an audience of families who'd been helped by our programs, sharing the story of my own journey from victim of deception to advocate for honesty and dignity in family relationships. 2 years ago, I thought my greatest accomplishment was the houses I'd helped build during my construction career, I told the gathered crowd. But I've learned that the most important thing you can build is trust between family members, and the most valuable gift you can give is acknowledgement of the love and sacrifice that hold families together. The speech concluded with an announcement that still makes me smile when I think about it. Marcus, now 10 years old and significantly wiser about family dynamics than most children his age, had asked if he could establish a small scholarship fund within the foundation, using his allowance money to help other kids whose families were dealing with disability and financial challenges. My grandmother taught me that the best way to use money is to help people you love achieve their dreams, Marcus explained to the audience. I want to help other kids learn that lesson too, so they can grow up knowing that helping others is more important than pretending you don't need help yourself. As I looked out at the faces in the audience that night, many of them families who'd found their way back to honesty and trust after periods of deception and manipulation, I realized that Ashley's lies had ultimately led to something more meaningful than the harm they'd initially caused. The pain and conflict of our family crisis had been transformed into a resource for helping others avoid similar situations, and my personal experience with financial exploitation had become a foundation for protecting other seniors from the same kind of abuse. The story that had begun with my spine being crushed by falling steel had evolved through my son's need for housing, my daughter-in-law's lies and manipulation, and our family's eventual return to truth and dignity. But it had ultimately become something larger than any of our individual experiences, a reminder that honesty and acknowledgement are the foundations of all meaningful relationships, and that the most valuable gifts we can give each other are recognition, respect, and the courage to tell the truth even when it's difficult. 3 years after the housewarming party where Ashley first stole credit for my generosity, I received the most meaningful acknowledgement of all. Marcus, now in 6th grade, wrote a school essay about his hero that described not my construction, career, or my recovery from my accident, but my decision to transform a painful family crisis into an opportunity to help others facing similar challenges. My grandmother, Elena Martinez, is my hero because she showed me that when people hurt you, you can choose to help other people instead of just staying hurt, Marcus wrote. She used her money to help our family get a beautiful house. And when my mom made mistakes about that, my grandmother used those mistakes to help lots of other families learn how to be honest with each other. She taught me that being a hero isn't about being perfect. It's about turning bad things into good things for other people. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. I never imagined Ashley was actively lying about how we'd afforded everything. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, with Jim asking detailed questions about every aspect of Ashley's behavior and me providing a comprehensive account of her lies, manipulations, and attempts at fraud. By the end, Jim had a complete picture of what his wife had been doing, and his shock had transformed into something harder and more determined. "Mom, I need to confront Ashley about this tonight," he said finally. "I can't live in a house that you paid for while my wife lies to everyone about how we afforded it. And I certainly can't let her try to cheat you out of acknowledgement for the most generous thing anyone's ever done for our family." I felt a surge of gratitude and validation hearing Jim's words. After weeks of feeling isolated and manipulated, by Ashley's systematic deception, having my son recognize and defend the truth of our situation restored something essential in my understanding of our family relationships. "Jim, whatever happens between you and Ashley, I want you to know that giving you this house was the most meaningful thing I've done since my accident. Using my settlement money to help your family achieve something beautiful gave me more satisfaction than any other use I could have found for that money." Tears ran down his face as he reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Mom, Ashley's behavior doesn't change how grateful I am, or how much this gift has meant to our family. No matter what happens next, I will never let anyone minimize what you did for us." That evening, while Jim was confronting Ashley about her lies and fraudulent schemes, I received an unexpected visitor. Marcus appeared at my front door with his school backpack, his young face serious and worried in a way that broke my heart. "Grandma Elena, Mom and Dad are having a really big fight," he said as I let him into the house. "Mom's crying, and Dad's really angry, and they keep saying words I'm not supposed to repeat. Can I stay here tonight?" I settled Marcus in my guest room with his homework and some of his favorite snacks, trying to provide him with the stability and comfort he needed, while his parents worked through the crisis that Ashley's deceptions had created. As I helped him with his math problems, I thought about how many families were torn apart by financial lies and manipulation, how children like Marcus became innocent victims of adult dishonesty and greed. Jim called around 10 o'clock that night, his voice exhausted but resolute. "Mom, Ashley finally admitted everything. The lies at the party, the fraudulent loan documents, even the threats she made when you refused to sign them. She's been living in this alternate reality where she convinced herself that taking credit for your generosity was somehow justified." "How is she explaining her behavior?" "She says she was embarrassed about needing help from my disabled mother, that she didn't want people to think we couldn't provide for our own family. She claims she was trying to protect our dignity and reputation, but she knows that's not really what this was about." Jim's voice carried a note of finality that suggested he'd made some difficult decisions during his confrontation with Ashley. "Mom, I told Ashley that she has to acknowledge the truth publicly. She needs to contact everyone who was at the housewarming party and explain that she lied about how we funded the renovations. And she needs to write you a formal apology that acknowledges your generosity and asks for your forgiveness." The idea of Ashley being forced to publicly admit her lies and manipulation was satisfying, but I found myself more concerned about the long-term consequences for Jim and Marcus. "Jim, what does this mean for your marriage?" The silence that followed was long enough to answer my question before he spoke. "I don't know, Mom. I can't trust someone who would lie so comprehensively about something so important, and I can't stay married to someone who would try to cheat my own mother out of credit for the most generous gift our family has ever received." 3 days later, Ashley appeared at my front door, her face swollen from crying and her usual confident demeanor completely absent. She looked like someone who'd been forced to confront the full consequences of her choices, and for the first time since I'd known her, she seemed genuinely vulnerable and ashamed. Elena, may I come in? I need to apologize to you for everything I've done. I led her into my living room, curious to hear what she would say now that her web of lies had been completely exposed. Ashley sat on the edge of my couch, her hands twisted together in her lap, clearly struggling to find words for a conversation she'd never imagined having to have. Elena, I owe you an apology that I don't even know how to begin, she said, her voice barely audible. What I did was inexcusable. The lies, the manipulation, the attempt to cheat you out of recognition for your incredible generosity, all of it was wrong and cruel, and I have no excuse for any of it. I waited for her to continue, interested to see whether her apology would include genuine acknowledgement of the harm she'd caused, or just be another attempt to manage the situation to her advantage. I convinced myself that I was protecting our family's reputation, that people would think less of us if they knew we'd needed help from Jim's mother to afford our home.